Antec is a brand that we've worked with since the very beginning of eTeknix. They were one of the first big brands that we started to work on reviews for. So I've seen a lot of products come and go from them. Some have been good, some have been bad. And today we have something that I personally consider a big step up from the norm. The Performance One Full Tower eATX case. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Oh, thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
Okay, so I won't beat around the bush. Antec have had some weird and wonderful cases over the last few years, including ones aimed at niche custom loop water-cooled builds and ones on the, let's say, cheaper end of the scale. I mean, I'm all for affordability, but so many of them utilise the same inner workings, just with different front panels to either aid in style or airflow, but nothing that kind of really gave the wow factor without alienating the consumer base with cases that are clearly aimed at the higher end of the scale. Which brings us to today. The Performance One is Antec's flagship case for 2023. And before I'd even received it, Antec told me that it was pretty special. Obviously, brands do tell us how special their products are all of the time, but the proof is in the pudding when we actually get into kind of looking at it in our studio to look at it for ourselves, because on paper, yeah, it ticks all of the right boxes. It's a full tower without being huge. It supports eATX motherboards, meaning that it's suitable for high-end builds, has plenty of airflow, and some pretty unique features that kind of make it stand out, not just from their own lineup of cases, but from their main competitors too, which I'll go through shortly. Firstly, let's talk about size. Being a full tower, you'd expect it to be on the large side, but at 522mm high, 230mm wide, and 522mm deep, it's not exactly huge. For comparison, it's 2mm higher and deeper than Corsair's 5000D, but comes in a little slimmer by 15mm or so, with support for up to eATX motherboards. So I'm hopeful that Antec have utilised the space well instead of just making the case overly and unnecessarily big for no reason. Especially as a lot of high-end boards, both on AMD and Intel, are now using a bigger form factor to cram in more components, including extra M.2 slots, extra power delivery, and more connectors. Now, in terms of design, let's not ignore the fact that the front clearly has some aspects that we've seen before on the Fractal Torrent. And while some may say it's a copy in that area, I'm okay with it. It's a design that makes sense for style purposes while also not impeding airflow. Now, to aid in that airflow, the P1 does come with 3 of the new Storm T3 140mm PWM high airflow fans in the front and a further Storm T3 120mm PWM fan in the rear. So considering the $199.99 US and $169.99 UK price tag, it's nice to see considering the competition generally only supply a single fan in the front and then the same in the rear, and none of them are high airflow. So they actually end up costing around the same as well, which just doesn't really make sense. Now, the rest of the design is pretty clean overall, with the front sporting the large slatted design, which can be easily removed to gain access to the front fans with its magnetic mounting system. The front also includes a fine dust filter, but is solid opposed to mesh, which should last a little longer on the front, because that's where the bulk of the airflow will be pulled through anyway. The top is completely removable, so installing components is even easier, and it gives you full access to the inside of the case, along with featuring plenty of ventilation. So the case actually has some kind of ventilation for air to escape, making it perfect for AIOs or even custom loop water cooling. The bottom also includes a full-size dust filter which pulls out from the front so that the power supply has sufficient airflow. This time it is mesh, but still feels on the stronger side of things, but shouldn't need cleaning nowhere near as much as the front. Now, the sides both feature 4mm toolless tempered glass panels which are held in by a thumb screw, which when removed the panels pull away from the top, and while this will allow you to look at the cable side of the build, Antec are already one step ahead with a split cable cover which screws together and mounts in place to hide the majority of cables out of sight. I honestly think the balance between the two glass panels and then the huge amount of airflow at the front and also at the top is pretty great, and we'll find out exactly what that means for airflow when we get to testing the P1 a little later on. Now, I mentioned at the start that this case has some unique features, and beyond the full stacked I/O, which features 2 USB 3 ports as well as a Type-C port, the coolest part of the case is the temperature display. In conjunction with the Antec iUnity software, you can monitor your CPU and GPU temperatures just by looking at your case, and can switch between the CPU and GPU temperature by pressing a button on the I/O. I've got to be honest, it's not the first time that a case manufacturer has put a screen on a case, but this is probably the most subtle way of doing it, instead of having a kind of large screen glaring at you from the side or the front of your case. Now, looking at the inside, it's very, very clear that this is a whole new chassis that's been built from the ground up, and not kind of, as I mentioned earlier, a repurposed design. And that's evident in how much space you actually have inside, even when you have the largest eATX motherboard installed, which still leaves plenty of space and, thankfully, doesn't interfere with the cable routing holes, which sit at an angle to give the best cable management options. And, of course, they do include rubber grommets, along with a further 2 on the PSU shroud with rubber grommets for passing through your GPU power cables and, of course, your front panel connectors. There's also another 2 cable routing holes at the top of your motherboard tray for your EPS connectors and any cables that may connect into your AIO, though these holes don't have any rubber grommets, but I wouldn't really expect them here anyway. Technically, being a full tower, it does have 8 PCI expansion slots, which, with a name like the Performance one, as you'd expect, include plenty of ventilation, along with the majority of the rear of the case being fully ventilated too. Antec have even added a small cutout towards the rear so that installing your expansion cards is a lot easier. You can actually get a screwdriver in there, especially if you have the handy dandy eTeknix PC maintenance toolkit available on store.eteknix.com. Shameless plug, I know, but we'll continue. Now, with a case aimed at performance, you'd expect big things in terms of cooling, and the Performance one doesn't disappoint, with space for up to 10 fans. You can fit 3 140mm fans in the front, the same in the top, a single 120mm in the rear, and then 3 120mm fans on top of the PSU shroud. The case, as you'd expect, also supports a 360mm radiator in the front, and then exactly the same in the top. And due to the amount of clearance, you can actually install both of them at the same time, with space for up to 60mm rads in thickness for both the rad and the fan in the front. Though the front fans can actually be mounted in front of the mounting bracket to allow more space for a thicker radiator if you wanted. Then lastly, there is space for a 120mm rad at the rear of the case, but this would probably end up being used for either a single fan or a square reservoir like the FLT range from EK. Can't see many people really utilising a 120mm rad inside this case. Now, there's also space for the largest graphics cards on the market, up to 400mm, which covers all of the latest cards from both AMD and Nvidia, while CPU coolers have plenty of space with up to 175mm clearance, which, considering the Noctua NHD15, which is regarded as one of the largest coolers on the market, comes in at 165mm, you shouldn't have any issues whatsoever. Around the cable side of the case, there's 8 pre-installed Velcro straps to aid in cable management, along with another 2 on the outside of the rear of the case for cleaning up any cables that are plugged into your motherboard or graphics card. There's also those 2 cable covers which hide those pesky cables coming from the PSU and the front I/O, so you can really turn this into a bit of a showstopper that's gorgeous to look at from both sides. The hard drive cage accepts 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drives and can be fully removed if wanting more space, or simply moved into one of the 3 mounting positions, while the rear of the motherboard tray can house an extra 3 2.5-inch drives to keep clutter to a minimum on the, let's say, business side. There's also space for 245mm long PSUs if wanting to keep the hard drive cage installed, while removing it gives a whopping 440mm of space for your PSU and its cables, along with 30mm of extra space outside of the PSU area to give space for routing cables, which is more than enough even for larger cables, like the ATX 24-pin. So I think it's clear to see that Antec have really stepped up their game on this one, with some kind of really well thought out design choices that not only look great, but also add functionality to give you the cleanest build possible, which I think it's safe to say, yeah, we've done it here. Now the big question is, how does it perform in terms of temperatures and airflow? Without going through our case testing methodology too much, we actually have a dedicated video specifically for that. So I'd invite you to check that out to find out what hardware we use and to give more detail on what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. The link for that is down below. So starting things off with our Prime 95 Thermark torture test to really get as much heat into both the CPU and GPU at the same time. And it's here that we see the CPU temperature sitting at a pretty comfortable 30 degrees at idle. And even when we ramped things up, the Antec Performance 1 still showed some very impressive results, only being beaten by the Fractal Torrent, a case that typically comes in quite a bit more expensive. The GPU temperature at idle again showed very strong performance at under 29 degrees, and then again at load it showed that the cooling performance of the case was able to keep things more than under control. The only cases that did perform better were again the Fractal Torrent and the Streakon BC1 V2, which is an open air test bench, and even then they were only less than 2 degrees cooler during load. The chipset temperature at idle came in with our best result we've seen at 31.8 degrees, and then at load it showed temperatures that are at the lower end of the scale, being beaten again by an open air test bench, and cases that are more expensive to buy as well. The SSD temperature again gave respectable idle temperatures that were lower than the likes of the Corsair 5000T and NZXT H7, with load temperatures coming in middle of the road, matching that of the NZXT H5 Flow. Though it could have been better, 50 degrees is still nothing to grumble at and won't cause any issues with thermal throttling anyway. Now when looking at how things are kept under control during gaming, we again see our CPU temperature outperforming most of the cases we're comparing against. Again with the only cases that are actually able to beat it being bigger and more expensive. The GPU temperature, which is arguably the most vital component during gameplay, almost comes in with the best result we've seen, only being beaten by the Fractal Torrent by just over 1 degree. Again, a more expensive and bigger case with much larger fans as standard. The chipset temperature was able to come in with a respectable number again at 41.6 degrees, outperforming most of its competition, though still falling slightly behind the more expensive cases from Fractal and Cooler Master, as you'd expect. Then our SSD came in around middle of the stack, outperforming some of the most recent cases from both Corsair and NZXT, though still seeing some similar cases outperforming it on this occasion, but still within perfectly safe limits with a respectable temperature. So Antec have clearly shown a huge step up in terms of design, aesthetics and functionality, but also in terms of temperatures across a simulated torture test and during gameplay. Now, the key point I think to take away is that, as I mentioned, the front looks very similar to the Fractal Torrent, and the performance is pretty similar to it too. So if you want to make a good looking case with great performance, then you need to add large slats to it. Couldn't be simpler. Jokes aside, the performance was actually better than I expected, and I'm glad to see Antec kind of really shaking things up a bit. But as we know, temperatures are one thing, but how was the noise? Well, this is where things take a bit of a nosedive. At idle, it was the loudest case we've tested, but only by 0.4 of a decibel, with the NZXT H5 Flow coming in a close second. Though it's at load during our torture test, which could be argued as worst case scenario, so you're unlikely to kind of see these results anyway. And this is where we see the noise levels exceeding 51 decibels, which is 9% louder than the next loudest case. Though, before you take to the comments, decibels are a bit more mathematically technical than that, but it's worth noting 9% as a basis of comparison. This sadly does let the Performance 1 down ever so slightly, though there is a bit of a saving grace. Now, with any case and the fans that come included, so 3 140s and the 120mm, and the fact that we test as a stock configuration, we simply let the fans do what they do best and ramp up and slow down based on the curve that is set by default. And with the Performance 1 doing so well in the temperature tests, what I'm trying to say is there is actually room to tweak things slightly to sacrifice a few degrees in favour of having lower acoustics. This is something that will differ from user to user, and because of it, I'm happy to kind of overlook it to a degree. If we had, let's say, okay temperatures and loud noise, then it's a different story. But that's not the case here. And instead we have a trade-off. And this is something that we see time and time again with case manufacturers. Some go for quiet operation and in turn get higher temperatures, while others aim for better and cooler temperatures, knowing that the noise output would be raised. The only time you can really hit a comfortable middle ground is going for larger fans, though this means going for a larger case to fit those fans in, and that's not really the idea here. The Performance 1 is a full tower case, though from a first glance you wouldn't know it. It's only ever so slightly bigger than a mid tower, and I think the space inside has been used extremely well. It's actually nice to see Antec launching a flagship case for 2023 where no corners have been cut, nothing has been skimped on, and it really can rival the things that have been done recently by Corsair, NZXT, Fractal, and the other key competitors. What I'm trying to say is, if you're in the market for a case that offers great functionality, a stunning design, and something that won't hurt your wallet too much, then yeah, I think the Performance One is actually a great case. And I'm keen to actually see what Antec do next. Will we see maybe smaller versions of this? Micro ATX, Mini ITX? Because if this is a sign of things to come, I think it's safe to say that Antec are once again a true player in the enthusiast DIY PC build market. What do you think? Have Antec, done enough to rival their competition? Is the Performance One a case that you'd seriously consider buying? Let me know in the comments section below. And that about wraps this video up. If you enjoyed it, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then consider supporting us through Patreon, where you'll get access to a ton of exclusive benefits, including behind the scenes content, monthly live streams, bi-weekly game nights, and much, much more. The link for all that good stuff is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys.